Representative Ro Khanna, Mariana Mazzucato, and Dr. Dambisa Moyo.
Okay, it's great to see everyone. This is the panel that's going to tie capitalism to democracy. Now, I know there are three groups of people here. One group is like, why is there an econ panel at the Democracy Forum? Okay, that's fine. The second group is like, wait a minute, isn't capitalism like the opposite of democracy? And the third group is like, isn't Barack Obama going to be speaking here? I want to get a seat early, but we're going to address all three of those. And I want to start with you, Congressman. What, in your view, what is the relationship of capitalism and democracy in the United States, and how has that evolved in recent years?
First of all, Austin, thank you for having me on the panel. If you want to have a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, people need to feel that their work has dignity and they have opportunity economically. If you don't have that, you'll have despair, you'll have resentment, you'll have malaise, you'll have polarization. That's not my point. It's actually President Obama in what I believe was his greatest speech, the Mandela Lectures, where he says that economic opportunity is the foundation for democracy. And I was actually in Galesburg, Illinois, which President Obama famously talked about in his keynote speech in 2024. I went there in 2022. I was speaking at Monmouth College, and one of the professors said to me, hey, Ro, can you talk to some of these folks from Maytag? And I said, didn't that close 15 years ago? And they said, yeah, but they met me for pizza, and they said nothing in our lives has changed. We're still telling our kids to leave. Congresses have come and gone. We have no economic opportunity. We have to address that if we want democracy to work.
Okay, Professor Mazzucato, you have a more global perspective. When you hear this, is there a way that we can, as governments, get desirable outcomes, address injustices, things of that nature? Is there some success story that the world does differently than we do it here in the US, or what do you think?
So I would microphone's on. I would begin with kind of the first principles in terms of how you're asking the question, which is such an important question, which is, what is capitalism, right? And what do we know about it? And the first thing I'd say is there's varieties of capitalism. There's levels of dysfunctionality or functionality that differ. And this is because capitalism, but also the economy, is an outcome. It's an outcome of how we actually govern all the different types of organizations in the system. So when we have companies in the corporate sector that are governed by just maximizing their shares, where we've had over $6 trillion in the last 10 years just being spent on buying back shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay, that's a lack of reinvestment of capital into the system. When we have a public sector that kind of forgets what its purpose is, and is at best is de-risking the private sector, enabling the private sector, or as an economist, and we're both economists, is kind of set up to fail because it's just worried about fixing things, fixing market failures. So it's literally too little, too late, and always out of breath. And if we have a relationship between them, which is not symbiotic or mutualistic, but kind of parasitic, then we have a problem. But there's nothing inevitable in that system. These are all consequences of choices we have made. There's agency in the system. And so I've been advocating for a very different type of governance of the public sector, which is about co-creating and co-shaping the economy towards an outcome, which has to be inclusive growth and sustainable growth. But that's kind of just blah, 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 unless we create an investment trajectory, what I call a moonshot scenario, where we actually apply a mission-oriented approach as inspirational as the one that got us to the moon and back in a short amount of time, but to tackle the social problems that we have, whether it's reducing the digital divide, carbon neutral cities, strong and not weak health systems. That requires a lot of public capital, private capital, but especially a way to collaborate that is symbiotic and mutualistic and actually has an end goal that is clear, what I would call the common good. And I don't think we have that. And if we look around the world, there's different examples and seeds of maybe what would work better. So on the goal side, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. That's 17 goals that we have since 2015, and some countries have taken them seriously. In Sweden, for example, every school meal has to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. And that's part of their climate strategy. Climate's not just about renewable energy, it's how it gets embedded in the system. And that then requires a particular type of outcomes-oriented procurement, something that we've talked about a bit in the past. So the tools that we have at our disposal can be redesigned if we actually care about what the outcomes are. And I have other examples, but I'm talking too much, so happy to bring them back in.
Okay, we will loop back, but let us turn to Dr. Moyo, or, if you may have seen, announced as a member of the House of Lords by the King, Lord Moyo. Let me ask this.
You're actually Baroness for women.
Baroness?
But thank you so much.
Moyo, Baroness. Okay. Walk us through, with the international perspective that you have, is capitalism the opposite of democracy? Does capitalism lead to inequality? That inequality undermines democracy, leads to authoritarianism? You've written and have thought a lot about that subject. What do you inform us?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. It's a pleasure to see old friends and new. I think we should, first of all, take away our ideological beliefs. And I know that can be quite controversial, particularly being in the United States or even in the West, where people are born sort of believing blindly in some instances in democracy and in markets. And I fundamentally believe in liberal democracy, and I fundamentally believe in market capitalism. But as Mariana just intimated, there are clearly variants of this, and there are clearly a number of weaknesses that have emerged. I think what we need to understand is that we have, as far as I'm concerned, the defining challenge that we have right now in the world is economic growth. And I know it's sort of a dirty word, but the fact of the matter is, if we do not generate economic growth, and by shorthand 3% per year, in order to double per capita incomes in a generation, which is 25 years, we are not going to be able to deliver education and healthcare and other public goods. We're not going to be able to fight climate change, and I would actually argue we will not be able to create liberal democracy in the way that we want it to exist. Why do I say this? Well, the data is pretty clear. There are wonderful studies that have been done, a little bit dated now, by Przeworski. He looked at data from 1950 to 2000, and he actually showed not just a correlation, but causality between per capita incomes and democracy, and argued that until and unless per capita incomes were at least $10,000, that's a pre-inflation number, which matters now, but unless a country's per capita incomes were at $10,000, you would not have democracy that would stick. We are seeing a lot of challenges in developed and developing economies around democracy. I would argue a lot of that stems from the fact that we have inequality and we have low growth. Participation rates in the United States have been relatively low, not just in the US, but across the world. And I actually argued in my book, Edge of Chaos, that we might be at a time when we need to start rethinking whether or not we should be actually make it mandatory for people to vote, because the numbers were stalling at around 50% participation rates. And for low incomes, it's even lower, 30% participation rates in democracy. But we've also seen illiberalism, not just again in developing countries. Look at the Freedom House data. They've shown consistently certainly at the peak, 70% of democracies are actually illiberal and indistinguishable from authoritarian states. This is not a sort of Africa or South America or Asia story. Look at Hungary, look at Poland. And so we are seeing an erosion of democracy. And I think the more that we see a deterioration in living standards and opportunity for people, I think we'll continue to see countries like the United States see their democracies downgraded, as we've seen from the EIU and others as well. So there is clearly a relationship. I think that we should be worried about economic growth, but we should also understand that as long as we're not generating improvements in people's living standards, we are likely not only to see a weakness in democracy in liberal democratic states, but we are also going to start to see a sort of proclivity and inclination of people to look at authoritarian states as perhaps being a solution for improvements in living standards. In other words, they may decide that there's nothing wrong with being in an authoritarian state or deprioritizing democracy in the interest of economic progress.
And do you think, I guess I would ask it two ways. Where do we go from here? What comes next? But if you think that some of the structural aspects of economic growth have slowed down in a lot of the advanced countries and places where the population is aging and may start shrinking, would these authoritarian regimes then essentially be rejected because they would be promising we'll restore growth to what it was when we were expanding, but they would not succeed at doing that, and so then they would be run out of town and replaced with something else?
Look, I think, I love Mariana's work because I think it's very important to understand what the role of the state is. And, you rightly, as she and I have talked, it's not just about a big state versus small state. It is about the quality of the state. And Mariana can make her arguments more eloquently than I. But let's not forget, China was the largest economy in the 1700s, the largest economy in the world. And it made a number of catastrophic mistakes that have been very costly. But clearly, they have an agenda. They are the second largest economy in GDP terms. And I know there are people out there who probably think GDP shouldn't be the metric. We should think about happiness and living standards. We can have that debate. But fundamentally, if the economy is not growing, I think the political class that can promise an improvement in living standards is the one that's going to win. And I'm afraid, whether we like it or not, democracies are under pressure because people, to shorthand it, in the emerging markets and in places like China say, well, the financial crisis came from the West. You've got bad inequality. You've got a political crisis coming from there. You're responsible for the climate change problems that the world is facing. So it's not exactly a situation where people in the emerging markets, where 90% of the world's population live, are looking to the West and admiring it. Certainly not in the way when I was growing up in Africa that we once did. So I think that's an important aspect.
So, Mariana, is that a challenge to the argument that we should embed more conditionality in our policy, that the government, if you're going to receive something from the government, you should commit to climate goals, inequality goals, various goals? Does that threaten to slow growth and thereby actually undermine democracy, or are you not as nervous about that?
I think there's two issues. One is on the quantity of funds, and one is on the quality, that issue of conditionality that we were talking about before this session. So when I talk about conditionality, it comes back to that point that I was raising before, which is the relationship. What kind of partnership do we have? The word partnership between the state and business isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. It depends on the quality of that partnership. And the reason I'm very keen on actually helping countries also develop metrics on what kind of ecosystem do we have. Again, what does it mean to build a mutualistic ecosystem? And central to that is that issue of conditionality. Because one of the problems is when we don't have enough public funds, so we have weak infrastructure, weak health systems, weak public education, when you have a weak state. But the other problem is that even when the state is putting in the money, if it just kind of lands in the system, which then can easily extract those funds or not actually develop anything interesting, coming back to my point about the common moonshots, that's also a problem. And if the state doesn't know how to negotiate that and has been outsourcing all of its capacity to McKinsey and others, that's a whole other problem. And so the idea of conditionality is, think about the United States. Every single bit of your iPhone that is smart and not stupid was actually invested in by the government. Internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, these are all outcomes of public funding. Now, not regulation, but public investment, right? Without DARPA, we wouldn't have the internet. The reason we have the internet is that the problem that DARPA actually set itself was to get the satellites to communicate. So no one was obsessing about technology. There was problems to be solved, often around military industrial complex problems. Hence the point today should be, what are the social problems that can also drive that innovation? But that level of investment was huge. And for every internet, we have lots of failures. So there's also risk-taking from the government side. Even, by the way, when the government bailed out Goldman Sachs after the financial crisis, the 10 billion bailout, that was also a risk. They might have not gotten the money back, right? But unless we actually talk about the government as a risk taker, what I call an entrepreneurial state, the title of one of my books, then we actually don't think through what does it mean to share in both the risks and the rewards. And if it's just about putting money in without actually thinking through what does it mean for intellectual property rights, how to make sure we don't just privatize every single bit of the technological trajectory, which gets us what we have today in the vaccine side, which is vaccine apartheid. We're not actually sharing the knowledge of vaccine production, and certain companies are refusing to do so, even though they benefited from public funding. Or again, think of all the problems we have today around big tech. Well, Elon Musk himself, by the way, got huge amounts of public subsidy for Tesla, for SpaceX, and so on. Where were the conditions attached to make sure that the kind of relationship that then was an outcome of that, the kind of technology that was an outcome of that, actually did good and not bad? Google's algorithm was state funded. And as Shoshana Zuboff in her great book, she says, you think you're searching Google for free. Well, guess what? Google is searching you for free. There would have been ways to actually embed within the conditionality, even of those grants, certain types of rules that aren't about stifling innovation, but it's about recognizing that value is created collectively, and how do we actually make sure that we're negotiating along the way so that we get a pre-distributive outcome that is good. Because otherwise what we have is we just think that, the economy is about the private sector doing things, and then the state has to come in to fix markets, to regulate, to redistribute the income to those less well off. But if we actually got those conditions right ex ante, and I'm talking about public-private relations, but also capital-labor relations, coming back to the stakeholder point, some countries actually have trade unions on the board of the companies. So together, they make decisions about the future. These are all issues about not just conditionality, but literally contracts. And we should pay much more attention to the deal, in the Green Deal, but also the deal in any area which requires that kind of public-private interface. And I do deeply believe, and I'm sure Congressman Khanna can also talk more about this, that if we got those conditions right, the outcomes would be more inclusive, would be more sustainable, so that our actual attention could be actually dedicated to the what's to be done instead of picking up the mess. And foundations, by the way, including the very important Obama Foundation, but the Gates Foundation, all these foundations that are out there should be helping us push the frontier instead of picking up the mess from very lame government and overly financialized business.
Now, Ro, she got applause on that. There were a lot of themes in that you've highlighted those themes.
I'm just trying to keep up with the economy. I'm trying to process it in real time.
So the talk about multiple stakeholders, the making of investments, the attaching conditions so that we make sure before it happens that we're kind of steering in the right way. As you look at the U.S. context, what do you think we should, are there, the decline of manufacturing in places like Galesburg, it's been a long trend. What can we do? I mean, what are the approaches that you see as worth thinking through?
Well, I don't think it's been a long trend in a passive voice. I think this country made a fundamental mistake in letting our production leave. We didn't invent the automobile. We didn't invent the jet engine. It was a German who invented the automobile, a Britisher who invented the jet engine. We figured out the mass production in this country. And for too long, we had this view, let's just have the Nobel laureates here, let's invent it here. It doesn't matter who does the production. And we saw the systematic deindustrialization of community after community that didn't just hurt white working class Americans. It hurt most, actually, according to Bill Spriggs, Black Americans, because of the deindustrialization of places like Chicago and the Black South. I agree absolutely that we need economic growth. But look, my district, the heart of Silicon Valley, we got almost $10 trillion of market cap. The problem in this country is many other places have faced the decline of the American dream. Thomas Piketty writes about how it's a staggering statistic. Since 1985, the middle class and working class have lost 25% of wealth in America. You wonder why people are anti-institution? That's the rational response. If your family has lost 25% of wealth under both parties for 40 years. Now, I believe that the problem was more one party, but that is the sense that we're struggling. And the racial wealth gap 10-1, partly because of the exclusion of Black and brown communities from the digital economy. So Mariana had a good point. She said, we got to go beyond fixing things. What has our response been? Let's give a little trade adjustment assistance. Let's give a little insurance here. We've had no systematic vision for the economic revitalization of communities that have been left out by the ravages of globalization. We've had no systematic vision for how do we get Black and brown communities to participate in the wealth generation of the digital economy beyond just popularizing those apps. How can we do it? You say, well, give me a concrete example. Google is partnering with HBCUs and community colleges. It's a very small pilot program. 100 kids are participating. They're working with these colleges to have an 18-month course, $65,000 job at the end of it, 10 hours a week, and it's working. Why can't we say, let's have 1 million people like that? That should be a goal. That we don't even need much government spending for it. Bring the tech leaders together with the community colleges, HBCUs, and the government. Why don't we have a moonshot of economic revitalization to make the new steel, to make the new aluminum, which will be cleaner, to make masks in America? We didn't make masks in America, to make more baby formula in America. So I think we have to have a whole new concerted economic effort that brings all Americans together to have revitalization and with a recognition that globalization has failed a lot of people.
You're going to get some applause. Now, Bisa, as you think of this, is this perspective kind of the perspective of the advanced economies? Could emerging markets do the same, or is this model kind of not apply to them? Would they hear our discussion here and say, uh-oh, that sounds like protectionism, they're going to keep our stuff out and try to prevent us from developing?
Well, that's what's happened, right? I mean, let's be honest. Many emerging markets, we're talking about globalization. I mean, it's all well and good in 2022 to look back and criticize globalization. America benefited more than any other country in globalization. So what happened? The question is, what happened to all that money that was gained? And I think we have to be honest and say part of it, as Mariana has pointed out, did accrue to capital holders and not to workers. We know that. Look at real wages. And we also know why that was the case. Why weren't there revolutions? Why weren't people angry sooner? Well, because we're all getting debt. And that was actually a great way of masking what was really fundamentally happening in society. But what else happened? What happened to all that money? Well, it went to fighting wars. And this has also been very, very clearly established. And I'm not sort of being cynical about it, but I mean, there has to be sort of checks and balances with policy decisions. We can't sit here and say, well, globalization in its entirety was a bad thing. I mean, I personally am pro-globalization, but I also am not naive enough to understand that there is a real politique, that ultimately politicians they aren't visionary. Let's face it, by and large, present company accepted, and of course President Obama accepted. But one of the problems we have is that everyone has grand visions. When they go into political office, they face tactics They're constantly dealing with the here and now. And the motivation, because we're dealing with these long-term structural problems, but the political system is short-term. We have elections every 2 years in the United States, every 4 years for the president. There's no time to make the hard choices and the key trade-offs that are required to actually lean into how we solve climate, to lean into how we solve the education problems or the healthcare problems that have been known from even before the pandemic. So, you ask me about emerging markets and what the learnings are from what has happened. I mean, the problem is, it is a sort of a fallacy to compare, because in places like South America or Africa, the decisions are pretty basic. They're looking for for a road, a hospital, for education to be delivered. These are basic public goods. And so there are a lot of arguments, and I'm not saying that this is my view, but you see why in these countries people say we need a strong centralized government just to execute, just build the school, just build the roads. Obviously, the discussions in Western developed economies become much more complicated. There are, decisions around capital versus labor. They're intergenerational in ways that you don't see in a developing economy. And so, what sort of learnings are basically being discussed in the emerging markets? And this is where I think this is really important, and the work of the Obama Foundation and Democracy and others is critical at this time. We do have to make the case for democracy all over again. We're not in the glasnost and perestroika era where people were seduced by democracy and market capitalism. The wall came down. I know many in this audience probably weren't around at that time, but it really did shift. There was a lot of momentum. The world moved, it changed, and people believed in democracy. They believed in market capitalism. Well, we've had a good 30 years of it, and people are looking around and saying we've got more inequality, we've got massive job losses and risk of job losses and lost job class because of technology. We have massive headwinds from climate change, enormous amounts of debt. We had a pandemic which was not predicted, and most of the problems that we're facing around productivity losses, inequality, not just in education and healthcare, but more generally, were happening before the pandemic occurred in earnest. And our governments not only failed to predict it, but they didn't even have solutions. I mean, look at the way we behaved in addressing this. So there's clearly government weakness. I'm not at all here saying that corporations are perfect, but I think unless we get good leadership that understands that they have to lean in beyond just the here and now, and they aren't just fighting to sit in office, we're going to continue to see, I think, a weakness in democracy and a lot more skepticism around it.
Ooh, okay, so Mariana, when you hear that, I guess I'm back to our original thing that I said as a joke, but maybe it wasn't a joke. Is there a tension of the engine of growth coming from innovation? Does that not empower certain industries, certain companies? Have they not shown that when you get a huge increase of power, that they control the levers of government and steer it to, not just regulation, but in any direction favorable to themselves? That in a way, the argument of globalization was these powerful forces, special interests, steered the money to what they were going to do. Is there a way around that? So in your example, if we identified climate change, let's try to design the incentives ahead of time to get outcomes, so we're not just having to correct for the problems. Would they identify climate change, or would we be at risk that they would identify the opposite of climate change? Whoever at tech would say, we don't want to make privacy a priority because that undermines our profit motive.
So, I mean, that's the whole point of government, at least in democratically elected societies. In theory, if we have the right leadership, you should be elected into office based on some sort of platform. Think of, again, the Green Deal or not the Green Deal, whether you believe in climate change or not. That shouldn't be like for us, the elite in the room, discussing whether or not that's even a problem. That in theory should be the way that politics actually, or democracies, debate. And what's striking is how so many debates, if I think about the Brexit debate in the UK, the current elections in Europe, the political debate here, which maybe has changed a bit in the positive sense in the last 4 years, but we're not actually talking about real things, right? And it's not just that we don't have the leadership, but the actual relationship with the real economy is often not there. And I think that's what also breeds populism. And even how you ask the question in theory is potentially, not that you're a populist, but the way that populists might say, oh, but isn't it true that all politicians are a bit corrupt? All businesses, as soon as they get power, they do the wrong thing. And then we all just give up and either don't vote or just complain all the time. And I think that's why it really matters, coming back to your really important first question, where do we see good and interesting things happen? Let's put a kind of microscope on it and scale those examples up, identify them first of all, so talking about them, and scale down the really dysfunctional ones. And coming back to emerging markets, I think it's potentially dangerous to use big words like that because there's huge differences within the emerging markets world on precisely these examples. And we did a report through my institute at UCL with UNDP where we looked around the world who did better during COVID within the developing parts of the world. And it ended up being places like Kerala in India, Vietnam, Rwanda, and Togo, not just because they woke up one morning and did great things, but on the back of investments they had actually made due to previous crises within their public administrations. And that's why I kind of, joked about the outsourcing to McKinsey. It's not a joke. This massive outsourcing of government capacity to other actors, whether it's consultants or not, is part of the problem. This lack of faith that government can do anything, that at best it can fix markets and enable or de-risk the cool people in Silicon Valley, your constituency, is part of the problem. And, coming back to the big state, small state in Europe, after the financial crisis, which was caused, we always forget this, by private debt, not public debt, we ended up on a massive wave of austerity in Europe, much less so than here. Here you guys had a 800 billion stimulus program, which initially at least was supposed to be green directed until the whole Tea Party thing happened. We instead did a massive wave of austerity. And the interesting thing was that by obsessing about the deficit, right, that was the obsession. So Spain cut its publicly funded research and development spending, which we care about, in order to reduce its deficit. Debt to GDP, and many of those countries actually rose. Why? Because if you're not investing in a strategic, smart way on that denominator, or in all the things that increase productivity and growth, then even a mild deficit, if you have zero in the denominator, the ratio can actually go to infinity, just mathematically, right? And so this obsession with public sector budgets or the size of the state, as opposed to that other point about, increase the capacity, the capability, invest in the civil service so we have great training programs, create creative bureaucracies, not slow, inertial, inflexible bureaucracies. These should be the questions of our time, because we're not going to tackle climate change. We're not going to reduce the digital divide. We're not going to get stronger health systems without a stronger, more capable civil service.
So,
can I just add one thing? I'm sorry, I just want to say one thing, because I think this is really important. We clearly, the tactics point, I think, is clear. We desperately need to solve these more structural problems. But I think what's really important also is that she mentioned Rwanda. Very often Rwanda gets put in a bucket of being non-democratic and actually criticized. And yet, going back to your question about what are the learnings, this is why I started off by saying we need to stop being so ideological, because there are things that are working in places that traditionally we would poo-poo and say, we can't talk to those guys, we can't listen to them because they are, illiberal. And yet, some of the most clever, and innovative ideas, and again, I don't want to come across as somebody who's anti-democracy. I've been very clear that I am very pro-democracy. But I think we need to, this is exactly the point, that actually if you're objective about where the learnings are for our societies to progress, you'll find that them in very surprising places that may not be democratic in the manner in which we've been trained to believe.
Okay, hold that thought, and I'm going to come back for a lightning round to give us success examples or anything you find interesting, like your Google example. But, Ro, you've served at the highest levels of government. And when you hear this, is American government capable of doing these things? Or are we so hyper partisanized that we can just forget it. I usually say, if you want to be a pessimist, turn on C-SPAN and see what our leaders say. If you want to be an optimist, come to my class and meet people who are under 30, and you'll be like, it's going to be fine. Like, these people are going to go out and do it. And in this audience, you've got an amazing group of folks that are around the world doing things to improve their communities, to improve their countries. Can the U.S. do it, or are we out of shape?
We can absolutely do it. And if there is one thing I'd want to share with the young folks here, it is that they should welcome the participation in American democracy. Look, as a son of immigrants, I obviously believe there were a lot of benefits to globalization, but we need a rebalancing of it. And what we're trying to do in this country is incredibly difficult. When my parents immigrated to America, immigration was 90% European. 90% European. Today it's less than 15% European. We're 60% white, non-Hispanic. There has never been a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy like this country that we're trying to do. Now, it wasn't a linear line for President Obama. It's probably going to take us longer. But the aspiration, the task is enormous. And the question is, I think actually democracy, there are challenges, the role of money in politics, the people who don't want to count elections, but I actually think part of it is working. And one of the things that's working is there are a lot of people who are giving signals saying, this system isn't working for me. And all of you have two choices. You can be part of the chorus of critics and diagnosis. We got a lot of them in Congress. Or you can do what Mariana is suggesting and our panelists are suggesting. You can be part of imagining the solution. You can go to these communities and you can either criticize them, and a lot of people on both the left and the right will tell you 100 things that are wrong with what's going on, or you can say, I'm going to build things. And I'll just give you one small example from my life. I was a overly ambitious student at the University of Chicago, and I wasn't smart enough to be a professor. But I had a paper which I wrote at the Committee of Social Thought, where there's this famous philosopher, John Rawls, and I criticized his theory of justice. And I said to the professor, what do you think? And he said, that was a pretty good paper, Ro. Now you try writing the theory of justice. Much easier to be a critic. Much easier to be a critic than to provide a vision. We need your generation to be the visionaries, to go to these communities that have been left out and say, here are the ideas. That's what's missing in the Congress right now, but I have confidence that your generation will do that.
It's when we were young, if somebody said, if I asked them, what are you going to do, when you graduate? What are you going to do for a living? If you had said, well, I want to make the world better, they would have laughed at you. They would have been like, well, good luck getting a job doing that. But now, there are people doing that, and it's not made fun of. Lightning round. We just have 2 minutes and 40 seconds. What's some example where you think, even if it's a small one, they're doing it right? There's something exciting. There's something interesting. It can be in the world of nonprofits, can be government, can be whatever you think. Yabisa, what do you see that's exciting?
Well, we're consuming 100 million barrels of energy every single day. 100 million barrels every day. And yet we also have 50 billion tons of emissions, which continue to go up during the pandemic. So what do I think are some of the things that are really interesting is thinking about the climate, not just as a climate change in a negative risk mitigation way, but really leaning in to think about solutions. And I'm very fortunate. I work in the energy sector a lot, and I'm hearing a lot of innovations from solar, wind, geothermal, battery, nuclear Gen 4. There is a lot of innovation going on there, and it's so critical in terms of being transformative. As we know, just yesterday, we clocked 8 billion people around the world, and India is about to surpass China as the largest population. So there are innovations going on around the world, and a lot of them are coming from the emerging markets. So I would say that's the area, particularly for me, I would say hydrogen and nuclear Gen 4 are areas that I find particularly interesting, but they are happening, and they're pockets of it.
Ariana, how about you?
Well, going to the moon was not just aerospace, right? It was massive amounts of investment in nutrition, electronics, materials. The whole software industry was almost a result of that. And that's precisely what you've just said. But that's not going to happen without an industrial strategy. And what's interesting is often when we've had industrial strategies in the past, it was just money given to sectors that lobbied their way up to say, help me. So having what I call a mission-oriented approach to industrial strategy, I think, is the future. And what that then means is how it lands on the everyday, whether it's how we do procurement, as I mentioned, for school lunches, or how we put in conditionality into the CHIPS Act. You know, in the US right now, we're putting huge amounts of money into the system, trillions. The Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Unless we build in conditionality to make sure that this public money is conditional on improving working conditions, improving worker pay so it actually rises with productivity, improving green procurement for all those supply chains for this technology, right? Because it's not just tech. There's a massive amount of materials that are required that can be green, in the same way that in Germany, when the steel sector recently requested a handout from the German public bank, it was conditional on steel reducing its material content. They today have the greenest steel in the world. Why? Not because they went to Davos to talk about purpose, but because they had to get €1 out of the government. So having an industrial strategy which is conditional to stimulate innovation, but with conditions that improve working conditions, green procurement, and the health of our planet, it's the only way.
Congressman, you're the opening act for President Obama. So bring it home. What do you got?
Well, as a congressman, I know to keep it under a minute.
Yeah.
So let me give you, look, President Biden signing the CHIPS and Science Act was transformative. And it's not just that it's $20 billion into Ohio. It's not just that it's going to create 8,000 jobs for carpenters and plumbers and machinists. It's not just that there are 2 new factories and national security on semiconductors. I'll tell you what it was. I was with the president in Columbus, Ohio, and there was a vice president of Intel, an Iranian immigrant with a thick accent, and he was on stage, and he brought an 8-year-old boy up to the stage, and he said, one day you're going to work for one of these Intel factories. And 4th and 5th generation Ohioans of both parties erupted in the wildest applause for this Iranian immigrant. And that's when I said, we're going to do this as a country. And that CHIPS Act, if we can have those type of things every year, we will be fine. And we're going to build a truly wonderful multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy.
He didn't disappoint. Nicely done. Thank you for your time.